Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I offer an update on the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, which occurred in May of 2022? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. I'll start with an updated timeline of the crime, then move to my updated analysis. On May 24, 2022, at around 11:10 a.m., 18-year-old Salvador Ramos shot his 66-year-old grandmother in the face at her residence in Uvalde, Texas. He then drove her Ford pickup truck to Robb Elementary School and rammed through a barricade at 11:28 a.m. The truck ended up in a ditch. The gunman was carrying an AR-15 style rifle and 7 30-round magazines. He fired several rounds at two people who had come to assist him, but they were not injured. At 11:30 a.m., a 911 call was made reporting the vehicle crash. 1 minute later, the gunman started shooting at the school from the parking lot. A school resource officer arrived on the scene after responding to the 911 call. The officer drove past the gunman while pursuing a teacher, who the officer believed was the gunman. A teacher was standing near a door on the west side of the school and saw the gunman. The teacher closed the door, but it did not lock. There are two different stories about what happened here. One story is that the door was supposed to lock automatically when closed. Another story is that the door could only be locked from the outside, and the teacher was not aware of this. At 11:33 a.m., the gunman opened that same door and entered the school. He walked into a classroom, which was internally connected to another classroom. The classrooms were numbered 111 and 112. A teacher tried to lock the door that the gunman was approaching, but the gunman gained entry and shot her as he said, "Good night." He then turned to the students and another teacher in the classroom and said, "You're all going to die." The gunman played what was described as sad music before firing more than 100 rounds. At 11:35 a.m., 2 minutes after the gunman entered the building, 3 police officers entered the same door the gunman used. A few seconds later, 4 more officers entered the building. At 11:37 a.m., 3 officers approached the classroom and were fired on by the gunman. 2 of them were grazed by gunfire, and all 3 of them retreated down the hallway instead of engaging the gunman. 2 minutes later, the gunman fired 16 more rounds. Several more officers arrived at 11:51 a.m. By 12:03 p.m., 19 officers were in the hallway not far from the classroom. Around the same time, a student in classroom 112 dialed 911. She called a second time 7 minutes later. She called a third time 3 minutes after this. At 12:15 p.m., a United States Border Patrol tactical unit arrived on the scene. At 12:16 p.m., the student in room 112 called for a fourth time. She made it clear that 8 to 9 students were alive in the classroom. About 5 minutes later, the gunman fired again. At 12:43 p.m., a girl called 911 and said, "Please send the police now." At 12:50 p.m., 75 minutes after the first officers arrived on the scene, 5 police officers entered the classroom. The gunman was in a closet. He kicked open the closet door and opened fire. The police returned fire, and the gunman was killed. Ultimately, 19 students and 2 teachers were killed by the gunman, and 18 people were injured, including the gunman's grandmother and the 2 police officers. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few items that stood out to me with the update in this case. Item number 1, not long after the gunman entered the school, he was confronted by the police. This was a significant opportunity to neutralize the gunman. There were 7 police officers on the scene at that time. 3 of them were attempting to engage. They should have pressed their numerical advantage and used their firearms to end the confrontation. Instead, they fled down the hallway to safety. Item number 2, the Uvalde School District Police Chief Pedro Arredondo was on the scene just 3 minutes after the gunman entered the building. He claimed that he discarded both his police and campus radios because he thought they would slow him down, and he wanted his hands free to shoot the gunman. In addition, he claimed that he did not realize that he was the incident commander, so he didn't know that he was in charge. Pedro's strategy to avoid taking responsibility doesn't really make any sense. As far as the radio story, as a police officer, it was his responsibility to be able to communicate. He can't just throw his radios away and say, "I didn't know what was happening." It was his responsibility to maintain his ability to send and receive information. I also found his reason for abandoning the radios difficult to believe. He needed his hands free so that he could shoot the gunman. When did he plan on doing that? It's more like he needed his hands free to hold them up, as if he was motioning to surrender. As far as the lack of awareness about who was in charge, again, this was his responsibility. He needed to understand the chain of command. I find his statement difficult to believe. If he really didn't know who was in charge, why didn't he say, "I thought this other person was in charge"? Like he could have specified the person. Who did he believe the incident commander was? Item number 3. At 11:40 a.m., which was 3 minutes after the 2 officers were grazed by bullets, Pedro used a telephone to call the police department. He complained that he only had pistols and that the gunman had a rifle. He said, "I need to get 1 rifle." I find this statement curious considering that in the video from the school, it's clear that 2 of the 3 officers who initially confronted the gunman were carrying AR-15 rifles. These officers retreated along with 1 officer who was carrying a pistol. The rifles only work when they are pointed at a target and the trigger is pulled. It appears as though they forgot about that part from their training. Item number 4. Pedro claimed that he attempted to open classroom 111 and another officer tried to open 112, but both doors were locked. About 15 minutes into the attack, Pedro said, "The door is probably going to be locked. That is the nature of this place. I am going to get some more keys to test." So he was relying on the nature of the school as his source of information. There's a conflicting report that indicates the classroom doors were actually unlocked, but it really doesn't matter. The police had the tools necessary to breach the door the entire time they were there. Item number 5. It was reported that another component of Pedro's defense was that he believed there was no one alive in the classrooms. He was dealing with a gunman who was barricaded and unable to harm anyone else. So essentially the police had the gunman cornered. Just over an hour into the attack, Pedro said, "We think there are some injuries in there, and so you know what we did. We cleared off the rest of the building so he wouldn't have any more besides what was already in there, obviously." As a side note, I noticed that during a brief confrontational interview after the shooting, Pedro also ended a statement with the word "obviously." This seems to be a habit of his. Saying that the victims were injured implies that the victims were also alive. It seems clear that Pedro knew that the gunman was still a threat to life. Item number 6. Pedro was highly concerned about disturbing the gunman. He said that he and the other officers in the hallway tried to stay quiet. Instead of talking in a normal voice, they whispered to one another. They thought that if the gunman heard them, he would start firing at them. Item number 7. While the gunman was still active, one police officer can be seen on the school video getting some hand sanitizer from a dispenser in the hallway. That officer did not engage the gunman, but he was not afraid of those germs. Those germs were confronted and neutralized without hesitation. Item number 8 is the importance of taking initiative. At one point during the shooting, one officer told another, "If there are kids in there, we need to go in there." The other officer responded by saying, "Whoever is in charge will determine that." These officers were in a crisis situation, which demanded the ability to think in a flexible manner. Not every answer can be prescribed by policy or come through the chain of command. Sometimes an officer needs to take initiative. They must rely on their training and common sense. Their training told them to engage an active shooter immediately, and their common sense told them that the gunman remained a threat. There are different types of courage. Some of these officers were probably willing to risk their lives, but they were not willing to stand up against their superiors. Somebody needed to step up and save lives, but no one had both types of courage. Item number 9. What the students in those classrooms went through was unimaginably horrible. In addition to facing a homicidal gunman, they had to contend with the police who would not help them. They called and asked for help. They instructed the police to confront the gunman, and yet the police waited. No one was going to keep the students safe. No one was going to protect them. No one who was capable of stopping the gunman was on their side. In addition to all the other terrible feelings those students endured, they experienced a sense of abandonment and loneliness in that room with the killer. 19 heavily armed police officers were standing in the hallway, but they may as well have been a million miles away. Now moving to my final thoughts. The officers involved in the Uvalde shooting failed to protect the students and faculty in the school. The series of implausible excuses offered in their defense does a poor job at disguising cowardice. The few who were willing to step up and risk their lives were stopped by those who were unwilling to take that same risk. Those are my thoughts on the update of the Uvalde shooting. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.